There is a single video frame, recorded in 1998, that shows a plastic bag lying on the floor of the Mariana Trench, 10,898 meters down, almost 7 miles. The bag is crumpled, half sunk in pale gray sediment, and something small is sitting on top of it. Nobody noticed the frame for 20 years. It was sitting in a database, and nobody had thought to look.
To see how strange that is, you have to start with a rope. On the 23rd of March, 1875, a British survey ship called HMS Challenger for exactly this purpose. The line went down, and it kept going. When it finally slackened, the reading was 4,475 fathoms, 8,184 meters. It was so far beyond anything else recorded on the entire voyage that they hauled the whole thing back up and did it again. 76 years later, a second Challenger came back with sonar instead of string, found the seabed deeper still, and the place took the ship's name, Challenger Deep. Then the arguing started. In 1957, a Soviet vessel, the Vitiaz, reported 11,034 meters, a figure that circulated for decades and is now considered too deep because the sounding was never properly corrected for how sound speeds up in cold, compressed water.
In 2010, an American survey put the deepest point at 10,994 meters, give or take 40. In 2021, a team reading pressure sensors carried down by a crewed submersible revised that to 10,935, give or take 6. 60 meters of disagreement about the lowest place on the planet. The pressure down there is over 1,000 times what you were feeling now, roughly 8 tons on every square inch. On the 23rd of January, 1960, 2 men climbed into a steel sphere and went to look at it. The sphere hung beneath a float the size of a railway carriage, filled with aviation petrol, because petrol floats and will not compress. Inside were Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, a 28-year-old U.S. Navy lieutenant. The descent took nearly 5 hours. At around 9,000 meters, a bang went through the cabin hard enough to shake them both. A plexiglass window in the flooded entrance tunnel had cracked. They talked it over and kept going, on the reasoning that if the pressure hull were failing, they would already be dead.
They landed in a rising cloud of silt and sat on the bottom for 20 minutes, and Piccard reported that as they touched down, he saw a fish, a flatfish, sole-like, perhaps a foot long, lying on the sediment and moving off as the lights came on. It became one of the most repeated observations in the history of exploration. It is almost certainly wrong. Biologists objected within months. The Danish zoologist Torben Wolff argued that Piccard had most likely seen an eyeless sea cucumber, and there are flattened oval species that would read as a flatfish to anyone who was not a specialist. Walsh, who did not see the animal himself, later said the stirred sediment made it like looking into a bowl of milk, and allowed that neither of them was a trained biologist, and the creature could have been something else. In 2012, 2 researchers published a paper in the Biological Bulletin under the title, "On the Validity of the Trieste Flatfish, Dispelling the Myth."
The doubt is not only about visibility. Fish appear to have a floor. In 2014, a team led by Paul Yancey showed that fish protect their proteins against pressure using a compound called trimethylamine oxide, and that they have to carry more of it the deeper they live. Extrapolate that curve, and it runs out somewhere near 8,200 meters. Past that, a fish would have to reverse the flow of water across its own tissues. The chemistry simply stops working, and the observations have held that line ever since. On the 15th of August 2022, a baited camera in the Izu Ogasawara Trench off Japan filmed a juvenile snailfish at 8,336 meters. That is the deepest fish anyone has ever recorded, and it sits almost exactly where the chemistry predicted it would run out. The floor of Challenger Deep is another 2.5 kilometers below that. You can go there. A fish cannot.
So what is down there instead? In 2011, a Scripps team dropped free-falling cameras into the Serena Deep and photographed xenophil fours at 10,641 meters. Giant single cells, no tissues, no organs, some of them 10 centimeters across, sitting on the mud in irregular crumpled clumps. And amphipods, small pale crustaceans, distant cousins of the sandhoppers on any beach, arriving on bait within minutes of it hitting the bottom, which should not really be possible either, because calcium carbonate, the material of shells and exoskeletons, dissolves under that much pressure. In 2019, Japanese researchers reported that the amphipod Hirondelia gigas secretes gluconic acid, which strips aluminum out of the trench sediment. In alkaline seawater, that dissolved aluminum turns into a hydroxide gel, and the animal wears it, a film of metal, manufactured on demand, holding its own shell together.
The mud itself turned out to be the real surprise. In 2013, a group led by Ronnie Glood lowered instruments that measured oxygen consumption directly in the sediment of Challenger Deep. Microbial activity there ran at about twice the rate of a 6,000-meter site nearby, with several times the bacterial abundance. The deepest place on Earth is not a dead end, it is a funnel. Whatever sinks anywhere in the surrounding region slides down the walls and gathers at the very bottom, which raises the question of what else is gathering. In 2019, researchers measured radiocarbon in the muscle tissue of trench amphipods and found the unmistakable signature of atmospheric nuclear weapons testing from the 1950s and 60s. Bomb carbon, absorbed by plankton at the surface, eaten, sunk, eaten again, and now sitting in the flesh of animals 7 miles down. The same work turned up amphipods 91 millimeters long and more than 10 years old, far larger and far older than their shallow water relatives.
2 years earlier, Alan Jamieson's team had tested Mariana amphipods for industrial pollutants, PCBs, banned across most of the world since the 1970s. The concentrations they measured were up to 50 times higher than in crabs taken from paddy fields fed by the Liaohe, one of the most polluted river systems in China. Which brings us back to the bag. It sits in the Deep Sea Debris Database, a public archive kept by Japan's Marine Science Agency and assembled from footage of more than 5,000 dives since 1983. In 2018, researchers went through it properly and counted 3,425 pieces of human rubbish. Over a third of it was plastic. Of that plastic, 89% was single-use. Below 6,000 meters, both figures climbed. More than half plastic, 92% single-use. The deepest item in the entire archive was that bag, filmed in 1998 by a submersible that had gone down to look at something else entirely.
The honest counter-argument matters here. 3,500 items across 5,000 dives is not a carpet of garbage, and the Haddle Zone is not choked with rubbish. And when Victor Vescovo reached Challenger Deep in 2019, the headline said he had found a plastic bag and sweet wrappers. Vescovo later said, flatly, that a reporter had invented that. What he actually saw was a square object, and a triangular one with a sharp edge and a stylized letter S on it. Man-made, he was certain. Plastic, probably. He would not go further than that. There is one more thing we found down there. In July 2015, NOAA lowered a titanium-shelled hydrophone into Challenger Deep and left it recording for 23 days, until the memory filled. Typhoons kept the ship away until November. When they finally played it back, the deepest place on Earth was not silent. Earthquakes, the long moans of baleen whales, ship propellers passing overhead, and a Category 4 typhoon roaring 7 miles above. We went looking for the emptiest place on Earth and came back with aluminum armor, 10-centimeter single cells, whale song, and a bag we can put a date on. The trench is not remote. It is downhill from everywhere. If that is the kind of thing you want more of, the rest of the channel is much the same.